know the truism which says that those who are perhaps the poorest, those most in need, are often the most generous. And we know, at least from studies done in the United States, that it's actually true, that people who are poorer give a higher percentage of their means away in generosity and charity, at least by percentage, than those who are better off. Sometimes this is projected on them as their own inability to manage money, but I think it typically seems to come from the fact that they don't fear poverty or not having, because they've known it. And they also seem to understand intuitively the distress someone may be in because they don't have something. They don't have money to meet an essential need, and they're quickly willing to give over what they have so that somebody's life is better off. And isn't that what we hear in the first reading today from the first book of Kings? But Elijah the prophet, the widow of Sidon, she has no name. A non-Jew, a foreigner, he had gone there in the midst of famine. And he asked her for food when she was down to her last handful of grain and drop of oil. And yet, with trust in God, she follows his dictate. She takes the very last that she has and makes a cake for him to eat. And makes one for herself and one for her infant son. She who was about to make this cake, have their last meal, and then lay down and die. Because of her trust in God and her trust in the word of the prophet, they were able to take from that small sack of grain, that small jar of oil, through the rest of the famine, never going hungry. Jesus takes this story and deliberately moves it in juxtaposition to the widow going into the temple treasury, giving her gifts, her offerings for the poor. She, the poorest of the poor, giving her very last means of self-support over because she knew she was supposed to, and because she too trusted in God's goodness. And the church puts these two readings together today deliberately. They are to help us understand what the depth of generosity means, a generosity rooted in our own trust in God, where we give not only from our excess, but from our own need. We give freely and generously, knowing that God will take care of us as well. And it is a message we should hear, and yes, be challenged by. But in fact, if we stop there, we would miss another point that Jesus seems to be making. For this beautiful story of the widow and her 2 small coins comes positioned just after another verse that we also read, a warning against the scribes and the Pharisees, a warning especially against the scribes who love to walk around and appear very religious. And yet, as Jesus describes them, they devour the wealth, they swallow the property of widows. So here we have a widow, and who is a widow? We've seen her in 2 readings. A widow is among the poorest of the poor in the Middle Eastern cultures, because a woman had no voice. And in fact, in Hebrew, the word for widow means voiceless, or she who cannot speak. A woman had no capacity to stand up for herself in public life. She had realms in the private world, the domestic world. But when her husband dies, she loses her mouthpiece. She loses the one who stands for her. She loses all control over inheritance or money, and she becomes entirely dependent on a son or on a family member, and if not, she becomes entirely dependent on the charity passed out from the temple treasury. And Jesus is reminding his listeners that these people we hold up as religious icons, these scribes who profess to tell us what the Word of God means, consume the wealth of widows. They take those things that were given into the temple treasury, that were given to be distributed to the poor and to meet the needs of the weakest in society, and they spent those same treasures on themselves, clothing themselves in fine clothes and eating rich and sumptuous meals. And the more severe will be the sentence they receive. So today we hear in the readings two stark notes. One, we are called to be generous. We're called to be as generous as these poor, non-self-supporting women who can barely make it, who give of their very sustenance that others may also live well. And we're called to recognize that as members of a first world society, as people who have the capacity to take care of and meet the needs of others, that if we're taking to ourselves those things which others need, if we use it on ourselves to make sure that we are taken care of to the nth degree, at the end of time, when we stand before the judgment seat of heaven, when Jesus is separating the goats from the sheep, we will be goats. We will hear that we didn't feed the hungry, we did not give drink to the thirsty, we did not shelter the homeless, we did not visit the imprisoned, we did not take care of those in greatest need. These readings here at the end of the church year are stark, and they should point us and pull us towards a reflection on where we're headed. The choice given us today is clear. Rampant, untold, reckless generosity, or a self-centeredness, a self-absorption that denies the very basic needs of those in our world who most need it. The homeless in our neighborhood, the poor around the world, refugees and migrants, and those who are desperate simply for a mouthful of food. The choice is ours.